I was researching Meyerhold, and I was very interested in the fact that he wanted to use fairy tales and commedia dell'arte to create a new tradition of actor improvisation and collective creation in Russia, where it really didn't exist before. And the journal that he published during that time was called Love for Three Oranges, the Journal of Dr. Dappertuto. And the very first issue of the journal included his adaptation of Three Oranges from Gozzi. Then in 1918, as I'm sure Kevin will tell us, he gave a copy of this first issue of the journal to Prokofiev and said, "We really want this to be set to music. Would you consider writing an opera based on this story?" And Maria was a first-year graduate student at the time, and we were working together. And I said, I would like to understand what the differences are between Gozzi and Meyerhold. Could we work together? You as my research assistant, we'll begin some translating, we'll do some comparative work. And that grew into this wonderful collaboration from there, where Maria became more and more of a part of the book, translated the Gozzi on her own. But also as a part of that process, it became clear that Prokofiev had used Meyerhold's version, not Gozzi's version, and that this important fact was lost to history, in part because Meyerhold was repressed under Stalin. He was arrested and shot, and he was erased from history for 15 years. And so part of the book is, what we want to do with the book, and what I wanted to do in those early moments was to reclaim the importance of fantasy and creativity in theater, but also to reclaim the legacy of somebody whose contribution to the opera was forgotten.
Great. And I loved the chapter where those proofs come out exactly about Meyerhold, and that the main version he used is from Meyerhold, not from Gozzi. Maria?
Yeah, I would like to maybe add how yes, it was a wonderful collaboration that started simply as a translation. I was translating the Gozzi's piece, but I soon discovered that the active translation requires a lot of research, and Dassia was mentoring me on how to carry out that research that initially I didn't even expect to be doing. My research expertise in a different area, but I found myself working on Venetian theater, 18th century theater, thanks to this translation, and it was a world that opened up to me. And I visited my first archive in person thanks to this work, and I soon understood by looking at the Fondo Gozzi at the Biblioteca Marciana in Venice, that what I had been reading about the fairy tales by Gozzi, this idea of he was doing something very literary. This was just an exercise for his own pleasure as a writer, was not completely true. I found out a lot about his relationships with the actors, with the theater managers of the time. And to me, that spoke about theater as a collaborative effort, theater as something you don't just do in your own room writing, for as a pastime, but an activity that you do to create a community of artists, and a community of artists who were interested together in innovating Venetian theater. There was a lot going on in Venetian theater at the time. Goldoni was a major player. Chiari, another major player there. So realism was becoming a thing. For the first time in Venetian theater, we were seeing stories of the middle class, right, being staged. So these fairy tales looked very different, obviously, from that. But my question became, why? Why are we dealing with fairy tales? And I think that with Dassia, with comparing Gotzi's work across time and across geographies. I mean, a long time, right? Like centuries, we still found something in common, and that was this drive towards innovation, this drive of trying things out, doing it very playfully. It's a very funny opera. We know that it's a joy to stage. It's a joy to work on, and see what happens, and see how we can change this the status of theater in the city of Venice in the end of the 18th century. So yeah.
Kevin?
Well, I would add to that, Dassia and I have known each other for a long time now, almost 20 years, and we have long wanted to collaborate on something. Dassia is a theater historian, obviously I'm a music historian, and we thought that would be a great pairing, and it didn't happen until Dassia had this idea to bring Prokofiev into what she was thinking about with this connection between Gozzi and Meyerhold. And I really took to this idea because this is a fairly well-known opera, but very rarely do you have the opportunity to have this very, very, very deep study of basically the literary history of the opera. That's something that's very rare. Also, I think it's very rare in the study of opera to be able to work closely with scholars from other disciplines, at least to the extent that we did in this book, with art historians, specialists in Italian literature and Russian literature, and of course theater history, and put together a book that really shows that this opera has an incredibly long prehistory and incredibly significant prehistory. Which I think is important because if we talk about this opera's place in history, it's often called one of the early modernist operas. And to fully understand what that means, you have to understand where this opera came from in the mind of Meyerhold in particular, and what Meyerhold drew on from Gozzi. So this notion of this being a modernist opera actually has a very long history before Prokofiev even gets to it, and that's one of the really fun things that we could look at in a book like this. And I think the other thing that I really appreciated about this project, there's obviously a translation of the Gozzi, a translation of the Meyerhold that Maria and Dassia did. The libretto has been translated many times, but never alongside those other documents, those other versions of the story. And so we decided that I should translate the libretto again, and this is the only one that has been done in comparison with the Meyerhold, and we found lots of interesting connections there, and we're really happy that we could have that in the book.
Yeah, the philology of this libretto is exactly what one of the main points that made me get interested about this opera. I was the person that proposed this to the theater here in São Paulo. And one of the reasons was also, well, of course, the whole history, the whole background, the complexity of this. For us scholars, this is like, wow, honey. So we are happy when we meet something like that. But also because in this crazy philology tale, there is also a Brazilian woman inside that is rarely mentioned in the book. That is Vera Yiannakopoulos, the translator to French. One of the translators, because there was two translators, her and her husband. And she was very important for us in Brazil because she was a soprano that went to Europe and America. And she was a little bit the voice in many ways of Brazilian modern music. She was the one that presented many times Villa Lobos to people. So I don't know if you knew that her importance was so big for us here in our classical world or not. And I would like you to talk a little bit maybe about exactly this translation into Russian, the version that Prokofiev made, and then in French, that is the language that we usually sing it. So it's so many languages, so Italian, French, Russian, and all this in the States.
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, and what happened? Prokofiev was working with a Russian text, and as Dassia mentioned, he received this text from Meyerhold. And as he wrote the opera, he was using the Russian text, and so the opera was originally written in Russian. And the problem was the director of the Chicago Grand Opera at the time was very hesitant to stage a new opera. First of all, stage a new opera in general, let alone one in Russian, because there simply were not enough singers on hand that could manage with the language to put this opera on. And it was a big enough deal at that time to put a new opera on to begin with. So he at least wanted to do it in a language that his singers were familiar with. So then the pressure was on to translate the opera into French. And Prokofiev spoke French, but at this point, his French was not quite good enough to do the translation himself. So he did get paired up with Yiannakopoulos and worked on the translation with her and her husband. And they would work through a section of the opera, and Prokofiev would come back and inspect it, and oftentimes make suggestions for the setting of certain syllables. But that's how the French translation came to be. The interesting thing is Prokofiev never seemed to have expressed a preference for what language the opera should be performed in. During his lifetime, it was performed in French and Russian and German. There was also a production considered in Serbian during his lifetime that actually never happened. But he seems perfectly happy for the opera to appear in any of these languages. He didn't seem to have a preference for one or the other.
Yeah, this is so interesting because he wrote that he was thinking about the text. Actually, he was writing the text at the same time he was writing the music. So it means also that this way of composing is very different from usual operas, and he was doing it in Russian, but he was not attached to the Russian at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about this fairy tale, Maria and Dassia. It comes from Basile, this very crazy ricotta tale. And then it becomes almost a tale about a querela, a thing between people in the theater, and then it becomes a meta opera. I would like you to talk a little bit the tale, and maybe even remember to the listeners what is the Three Oranges about.
Maria, why don't you do the Italian version, and then I'll talk about the meta-theatrical elements in the Russian version.
Absolutely. So yes, as Ligiana was saying, this story is even older than Venice 18th century. We don't know how old it is. It's a folk tale. There is a written version that we think is the closest predecessor, Basile. But there's so many other points in the story that connect to other stories that we know about in the oral tradition that might not maybe we haven't gotten to us, or maybe have never been written. The story is about a hypochondriac prince. He is not happy. His dad wants him to marry, but he can't shake off his sadness. He can recover if he's made to laugh. And so his dad is hiring gestures and clowns and preparing a party so that he can laugh finally and be freed from his hypochondria. Now, the setup is obviously ridiculous. It is what makes us laugh since scene one, right? This also gave, in the Venetian version, a lot of chance for improvisation, and that was the best, moments for the actors and the audience. So it's 3 acts. After he's made to laugh, there is a curse, right? That changes the story completely. So this curse is he is going to be running after 3 oranges. That is something he cannot avoid doing. He must go on a quest. So Act 2, he goes on this quest, and there is challenges. He completes the challenges to find these 3 oranges, and then finally, the end of the story is these 3 oranges actually contain princesses, and he has to save them by quenching their thirst, right? And I'm not gonna unveil the ending, but he will find his pretty princess in the end, right? Now, what I was talking about earlier, the theater innovation, these ideas of playfulness, let's collaborate with theater artists to stage new ideas, for new dramaturgical ideas. This in Gozzi became an excuse. The fairy tale, this fight between a father who wants the son to marry, the wizard who wants to protect the prince from this curse, and the witch who is cursing the prince. All of this, very standard, we might say, fairy tale dynamic, right, becomes a pretext for staging the Venetian theater players of the time, and how they were also battling against each other to sort of like monopolize the theater world with their work and with their dramaturgical ideas. And that's the part, this meta-theatrical part of the Gozzi, which had never been translated before and never been staged before. So basically what we had seen on stage for Gozzi's productions until our translation was the fairy tale without the meta-theatrical elements, right? Now it was this meta-theatrical element that was taken by Gozzi and used for his own avant-garde innovations. And I'll pass it on to Dassia here.
So one of the things that's really wonderful about this published version of Three Oranges that Maria is talking about is this dialogue of the playwright with his memory of how it was performed and how the audience reacted and what he thinks it means in terms of theatrical innovation and specific moments that were really strong in the acting that the audience appreciated. And it was this meta-theatrical, to use the word somewhat idiosyncratically because the word didn't yet exist, but this meta-theatrical commentary on the creation of the performance that Meyerhold and his collaborators, Konstantin Bogak and Vladimir Solovyov, were really interested in. They were interested in theater that didn't hide behind a fourth wall, They were interested in theater that was about human creation and celebrating in human creation joyfully, rather than theater that was simply a reflection of everyday life, which they thought didn't really contain art in its fullest sense. It was simply reflecting life rather than commenting on and creating and making life. So what they did is they didn't want to just simply translate Gozzi. They wanted to make Gozzi relevant to their own time and their own experiments. And so they took the idea of that commentary and they turned it into characters and scenes. So, for instance, there are three eccentrics in the Meyerhold version of the divertissement, as they termed it. And those three eccentrics who interject and comment on the action. In an early draft of the play, it says that the three eccentrics are the three authors who created it. So they wrote themselves into the play itself as a way of sort of playfully erasing the boundary between life and art, and between the students who were performing scenes from it at the studio and the creators of the piece itself. The other thing that is really noticeable about this version is there are these scenes that are interludes. So, and sometimes the interludes are just a phrase that was taken from the Gozzi that's expanded into a whole scene, like the card game between Fata Morgana and the magician Celio, wizard Celio. That was a line in Gozzi, and Meyerhold and his collaborators transformed this into a whole scene that then, of course, later on becomes one of the most beloved scenes in the opera. My favorite one, this one does not make its way into the opera, is a scene in which Brighella tries to advocate for commedia dell'arte as the best kind of theater by performing a piece for the audience where he transforms into Harlequin, and then Harlequin doubles himself, and then Harlequin has an argument with himself about what he should do because he's in love with Smeraldina, and then Harlequin ends up hitting the other Harlequin, which is himself, with a slapstick. So long before Brecht, you have these self-referential elements, you have interludes, you have framing characters, and you have comments on the action that together encourage the audience to believe in the fantastical and encourages the actors who were working on it in the studio. It wasn't fully staged there, but they did use it as classroom material. Encourages the actors to get into a mindset where they too can begin developing their own work. So the last point that I want to make is that Meyerhold, the director, is often accused of turning actors into marionettes or into machines with the system of biomechanics that he developed in the early 1920s. But this scenario, this divertissement, really shows that what he fundamentally wanted was for actors to be generators of their own material and for theater to be a place of creativity.
This is so great. About this meta and parodical universe, Kevin, do you see a musical meta musical in this opera? I mean, we have in the dramaturgy all this is so present, but I don't know if in the music we can find it. Because of course we find all the time there is Tamino, there is Orfeo. There are so many opera, also for us that are from opera world. There are so many roles and images that we can connect with opera history. But is there musical inside the music? Can we see this meta tradition?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Of course, on one level, because Prokofiev adapted from Meyerhold, just in the very construction of the opera, there is this meta-theatrical element, because the three eccentrics become a band of eccentrics. So all of these characters that are present in the Meyerhold that help create this meta-theatrical effect, they're all in the opera too. But I also would say on a purely musical level, this is an opera that is full of references to different operatic styles. So there's some references to early 19th century Italian opera. You can hear moments of Rossini and Bellini. There is moments that sound very much like Debussy. There are a couple very clear references to Wagner. And Prokofiev was doing this intentionally. He knew opera very, very well as a composer. And he was also somebody who is very much concerned about individuality. He never wanted to be accused of sounding like somebody else. So actually in this opera, he's very much intentionally trying to have these moments where he sounds like somebody else. And in fact, one of the critics at the premiere of the opera said something along the lines of, this is clearly an opera about opera, because there's so many moments when it seems to be referring to the enterprise of opera itself through all of these references. So I think at least on that level, Prokofiev was trying to do something similar to what Meyerhold brought to the divertissement in terms of this meta-theatrical element.
Great. Listen, this Zoom thing is going to ask us to stop. Do you mind if I send you another link so we can continue? We have still 5 minutes, but I would like to ask some more, and the guys would like also to ask some more things. So I will send through the email. But for now, we're still having 5 minutes, and I'd like to talk a little bit about this. When Dassia said make Gozzi relevant to his time, to their time when Meyerhold made it, I was thinking about this phrase because at the end of the opera, this very, very racist phrases pull over when we read the libretto, when he says une négresse, all these things, when he meets Smeraldine in trying to become the princess. And one of the decisions here in Brazil was to change these phrases in French. So I'm changing all the racist things, because it's not possible that in Brazil we say this like nothing. So I was thinking that I'm trying to make also Gozzi relevant to our time here in Brazil, because otherwise it would become like a polemic. And do you agree with this?
Maria made some interesting discoveries about what the word meant in Gozzi's time, which is not as directly racially based as it became in later versions of the play, where yes, there were horrific instances of the use of blackface in the production history. But Maria, did you want to talk about what the word actually meant in its time?
Yes, so it was an indicator of difference for sure, but it is unclear how much race was part of that definition of difference, because there was religion and geographical provenance. Nationality was very blurry. Indicator of a person at the time, and so it is. I should say first of all, I do approve of this change for our current day. I don't think any explanation of where this term came from in Gozzi could have really help the staging in any way, but yes, in the Gozzi we have this idea of Smeraldina is opposed to the princesses, and the princesses are described as beautiful and white, and that's part of the fairy tale dynamic of you have the heroine and the evil character, and in fairy tale, in the imaginary of a fairy tale, those are translated into color. White as the color of weddings and the worlds of luxury and castles and princesses, while black is the color of the devil and evil and bad things and dangerous things, right? So those fairy tale colors translate into racial colors that then in turn translate into these very blurry national religious definitions of difference. So this is what I try to explain in my notes about in reference to the term more that was used. But yes, I do approve, Ligiana, of your choice.
I'll begin by giving a little bit of context for the Russian theater, and then Kevin, you can jump in with Prokofiev's relation to that, which maybe is a great opportunity. I mean, you know what you want to talk about, but it strikes me as a fun opportunity to talk about that first Leningrad production that you wrote about in the book. Which incidentally was staged by a former student of Meyerhold. So I think I already touched on what I think were some of the really important aspects of theater in Russia in the 19 teens and in the early revolutionary period. But I want to go back to an essay that was written just maybe 3-4 years after the Moscow Art Theater first opened, when it hadn't even yet finished staging all its early Chekhov productions. It was an essay called Unnecessary Truth by Valery Brusov. And in this essay, very, very early on, Brusov argued that theater that just copies everyday life doesn't have enough art in it. And that the closer you try to imitate life on the stage, the more the audience will actually just look for the discrepancies between real life and what they see on the stage, and that it's therefore better to just, if you want to represent a forest, just hold up a sign that says forest instead of trying to reproduce every single leaf on every single tree. And I think this was a real inspiration for many of the experimental artists in this period. There were puppeteers like Nina Simone-Chefimova and Yulia Slanimskaya. There were directors like Alexander Tairov and Vsevolod Meyerhold and Nikolai Yevrenov, who each in their own way were trying to figure out what the unique language of theater itself is. Not theater that is a simple staging of literature, not theater that is just paintings in motion on the stage, but what is the language of theater itself? And out of that question came a massive amount of experimentation in lots of different directions that then became most famous, the period of Cubism and Constructivism in the Soviet 1920s, but it really grew out of this earlier period.
Great. One more, Raul?
Maybe Kevin?
Sure,
would like to talk?
Yeah. So to talk about Prokofiev's relationship to experimental modernist theater in Russia is a difficult question, because Prokofiev, of course, left Russia in 1918, and initially he planned to be away for a short period. He just thought that this was maybe a better idea for his career at that point, to spend a year or two outside of Russia. But he ended up living abroad until 1936. He didn't go back to Russia full time until then. So it's a huge period of his life when he was living away from his homeland, and also conceiving of his career as very much Western oriented. He was very much thinking about writing operas for the West and not writing operas for Russia. And that's why I think Love for Three Oranges is so interesting in particular, because it's the one opera that actually gets staged that has a very clear connection not only to Russia, but to Meyerhold in particular. And we know that one thing Prokofiev really wished for over his long career was that one of his operas would be staged by Meyerhold, and he really wanted it to be either The Gambler, which was his first fully completed opera, or Love for Three Oranges. And unfortunately, that collaboration never came to be. But in 1926, Prokofiev learned that there would be a production of Three Oranges in Leningrad, and it would be directed by Sergei Radlov. And Radlov was one of Meyerhold's students. So this was the closest Prokofiev got to that long hoped for opera staging by Meyerhold. The best was that it was one of Meyerhold's students. And this staging in Leningrad was in many ways more consequential than the premiere of the opera, the world premiere of the opera in Chicago, because Radlov, as a student of Meyerhold, was able to bring a lot of Meyerhold's aesthetics to the production. And this included lots of effects on the stage in terms of circus elements, for example. There's a lot that was obviously very funny. There was a character that came in as a puppet and slid down on a rope to the stage and then jumped up as the singer from behind a table. There were lots of funny things, but also this was the sort of blending of theater with popular elements that Dassia could probably say much more about. But Prokofiev was so impressed with this production and so impressed with the very, very positive reception to this production, which was definitely not the case in Chicago at the world premiere, that I really believe that this was one of the factors that got him thinking about building more of a career back in Russia and eventually returning there permanently in 1936. And this production that Radlov mounted in Leningrad ran for 3 years, and it was enormously popular during those 3 years, and it only ended because they ran out of money to pay the rights to Prokofiev's publisher in Paris. And that was something that never happened in Chicago. There were a couple performances in Chicago, and then that was it. The opera was not staged there again for quite some time. So this production in Leningrad was very consequential in many ways.
Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Tem mais alguma, Jaua? Pergunta?
Actually, Kevin kind of answered my another question, that
Good.
how the public received the audience in Chicago received the opera, and how was in Europe, and how was this the critics at the time. A little bit, maybe if someone else want to talk a little bit about it, but Kevin also spoke a little bit, and for me it's more clear now, like from the difference of the productions as well.
I'll let Kevin talk mostly about that, but I want to say one thing, which is that when there's this, and Kevin's going to know this in more detail, but there's this sort of myth or misconception that when the opera premiered in Chicago, it was a flop, partly because it was so expensive. And that was covered a lot in the press, the price per orange of Three Oranges, but also because it was controversial. And I think Chicago was more accustomed to measuring success by praise rather than by controversy. But what Meyerhold said around the time that he and Vogak and Solovyov wrote their Three Oranges, he said that he thought that the best measure of a production's success is its controversy. That if you divide the audience in two, and some love it and some hate it, then actually you've shaken them up a little bit. And so I love to bring that idea and that measure of success into this world premiere that happened just over 100 years ago.
Great, great, beautiful. Just to end, because we can't keep talking, we could keep talking about the Three Oranges for the whole day, but we don't have that much time. So, when I think on the dramaturgy of this opera, I see two main moments. The first moment, this little hero, which is now not a hero yet, he's looking for himself, and at the next moment, when he finally finds himself by laughing, he needs to find the other, so the love and the fairy tale like begins in this moment when the curse happens. I'd like to ask you guys personally and also academically, what this fairy tale and this story and this opera has to teach, to talk to us nowadays. Why is this prince still looking for himself?
Well,
I'll say one thing, and then Maria, you can jump in. I'll say one thing, and Maria, I'm sure your answer will be actually a closer answer than the one I'm going to give. I'll say what it meant to us to be writing about a prince who's dying of hypochondria during a global pandemic. It was very meaningful to be collaborating internationally with all of these writers from many different countries in 3 different languages, 4 if you include Phoenician, and finding a way to celebrate joy at a time that was difficult in the world. And so the metaphor of the prince who's dying of hypochondria, who can only be cured with laughter, we thought that it's really important that scholarship and opera and theater not take themselves so seriously that people forget to laugh. And Maria, go ahead.
Yes, you nailed it, Dassia. I was going to similarly refer to not forget to laugh teaching, but also I was going to refer to our dedication, Dassia. Grandmothers, the fact that Gozzi sort of like felt he had to justify himself all the time for this unusual choice of fairy tale as source material for something that he definitely considered serious work, right? And the fact that that he also saw the source materials historically as something that may belong to the past and to our grandmothers, but it can always be made actual and teach us something. So yeah, never forget to laugh, but also never forget where things come from. Past is important to our present, and never forget that even when they might look not serious on the surface, they might contain very deep truths. So do not discriminate source materials, where stories come from, in times or place, because there's still some truth. There will be a truth in it.
I'll just add that I agree with my collaborators that it meant a lot during the pandemic to be working on something that deals with laughter and a theatrical thing that is just fun at the end of the day, right? And I think another important thing to keep in mind is that very few 20th century operas have, I don't know if it's fair to say that Three Oranges has entered the repertory, but it's I would say close to having done that. This is an opera that gets performed quite often as far as 20th century operas go. And I think that that's significant because on the surface, this is a very fun story. It's a fun opera. It's enormously entertaining, and I think it offers so many opportunities for for a dramaturg, for one, that there's so much that you can do with this opera. And a lot of it has to do with all of these layers that we discovered by peeling back and looking at the history of this work. And I think that has to do with why this work has been so enduring. You know, it's fun to listen to, it's fun to watch, but it's also very deep. It's funny, but it's deep.
Great. Do you think there is something I missed asking that is so important for us to the public to hear? For me, it's great already.
I'll just say one final thing, and that is in the context of Putin's war against Ukraine and the repressions in Russia. I feel like looking back on the publication of this book and thinking of the Russian authors that we collaborated with and the Ukrainian archives that let us use images, I just want to say that the other thing I think this project taught us is the importance and joy and necessity of learning to see the world from other people's perspectives. And that is something that we were able to do with our international collaborators on this project.
Yeah, this is so important. Actually, so many theaters decided to not do Russian operas in this period. And it's so important for us to be doing this. Exactly.
Exactly, because I mean, you know, even the history of this particular opera and the Stalin era repression is very instructive about what's happening right now.